All right, let's jump right in. Now, when you think of someone writing a guide to the inner life, about faith and character, a tough-as-nails naval admiral, a master of global sea power, is probably the last person that comes to mind. But that is exactly what we are looking at today. It's an absolutely fascinating book from one of history's great military minds about a subject you would just never expect.
So the author, Alfred Thayer Mahan, he wrote this book pretty late in his life. And he kicks the whole thing off with this really profound question. I mean, think about it. Forget the battles, forget the promotions, forget all the stuff you accumulate. When it's all said and done, what do you actually get to keep? This one question right here is basically the anchor for his entire journey.
And the contrast here is it's really striking. On one side of the coin, you've got Captain A.T. Mahan, the strategist. This is a guy whose books were required reading in pretty much every major navy on the planet. His ideas literally shaped the course of modern history. But on the other side, you have this incredibly reflective author who's trying to map not the world's oceans, but his own soul, what he called the harvest within. It's the same man, but two totally different voyages.
So first up, let's join the Admiral on what he really considered his final and maybe most personal voyage, this attempt to chart his own inner world and just make sense of a whole lifetime of experiences. He was incredibly humble about it in his preface. He didn't come at this like some theologian who had it all figured out. Not at all. He saw his life's conclusions as, in his words, fragments, kind of like scattered pieces of a puzzle. This book was his big attempt to gather all those loose ends, all those lessons learned from a life of action, and arrange them around one single unifying idea.
So what was that big idea? What was the one thing he landed on that could tie it all together? Well, for Mahan, it wasn't some complicated philosophy or a rigid set of rules. He boiled it all down to a single, powerful motivation he called a surpassing enthusiasm.
And here it is. This is his core idea. This enthusiasm he's talking about wasn't about just, memorizing doctrine or theology. For Mahan, it was a deep personal affection for the character of Jesus Christ. He believed that this single focus, this relationship, was powerful enough to bring clarity to every single decision and give purpose to every single action.
And this quote just nails his point, doesn't it? He's basically saying that if every action, big or small, is guided by this one motive, life just stops feeling so fragmented. It all comes together into a coherent, unified whole. And for a guy who spent his entire career creating grand, unified strategies for navies, well, it makes perfect sense that he'd apply that same kind of thinking to the inner life.
Okay, so a surpassing enthusiasm is the goal. That sounds great, but how do you actually get there? Well, for a military man like Mahan, the answer was pretty straightforward. It's through the discipline and obedience of the will. He saw it as a clear, step-by-step process.
He lays out this really clear three-stage progression. It all starts with submission. This is the hard part, right? It's the grunt work. You're doing what you know is right, but man, part of you is still fighting it, kicking and screaming. Then, if you stick with it, you move to the next stage, acquiescence. This is where the internal fight stops. That resistance just disappears. You're finally at peace with the direction you're headed, and then finally you reach cooperation. This is the goal. You're not just passively accepting God's will anymore. You are actively and enthusiastically partnering with it.
Now, this is the part I find really cool. He connects this internal psychological journey directly to the first three lines of the Lord's Prayer. Hallowed be thy name. That's the act of submission, right? Recognizing a higher authority. Thy kingdom come is that quiet acquiescence, letting that authority rule in your heart. And thy will be done, well, that's the ultimate goal, active cooperation. It's just a brilliant way to frame the whole process.
All right, now Mahan doesn't just stick to the easy stuff. He definitely doesn't shy away from the tough questions. A pretty big part of his book is actually him trying to reconcile his faith with parts of the Old Testament that are, let's be honest, really difficult to read.
He confronts commands like this one head-on. This is the mandate given to the Israelites about the people living in Canaan. I mean, to a modern ear, it's brutal. It's shocking. And Mahan, as a military historian, clearly felt like he had to provide some kind of justification for it.
So Mahan's argument basically frames this not as some random, cruel violence, but as a harsh necessity that had a very specific, divine purpose. He lays out three main justifications. First, the preservation of faith. The idea was to stop the unique concept of one God from getting watered down and lost. Second, preventing corruption, to isolate the Israelites from what he saw as really dangerous social and religious practices. And third, what he calls the continuity of revelation, making sure the lineage survived through which, he argues, a final divine message would eventually come to the world.
And this is where his argument gets incredibly provocative, especially for his time. He doesn't just leave this as some ancient abstract problem. Oh no, he brings it right into American history, drawing a direct line from the conquest of Canaan to the European colonization of North America.
This quote, wow, it really lays his logic bare. Now, whether you agree with it or not, and a lot of people today certainly would not, his argument is that at certain moments in history, a higher civilization has a kind of providential right, or maybe even a duty, to displace a lower one if it serves a greater purpose in the big picture of human progress. It is a very stark and challenging perspective for sure, and one that's deeply rooted in the worldview of his era.
So, after wrestling with all that heavy history and theology, Mahan brings it all back home, back to the individual, and to the central metaphor of his book, the final harvest of a life well lived.
In his final thoughts, he makes this incredibly powerful distinction between a life of doing and a life of being. And this is so relevant today. We live in a world that is just obsessed with doing, our activities, our to-do lists, our achievements. Mahan warns that this can be a really dangerous distraction, just a substitute for actual living. The real goal, he says, is a life of being, of cultivating who you are on the inside, your character, your transformed nature. The doing should flow from the being, not the other way around.
And this quote just sums it all up perfectly. For Mahan, old age isn't a time of decline. It's a time of reaping. The harvest isn't your resume. It's not your bank account or your list of accomplishments. The harvest is who you've become. It's the character that's been forged through a lifetime of choices, struggles, and that surpassing enthusiasm he talked about from the very beginning.
So we end right where Mahan began. A naval admiral, a man of action and global strategy, came to the conclusion that the single most important thing you take away from this life is your own transformed character. That's a really powerful thought, from a very unexpected source, and it leaves us with a pretty critical question to think about for ourselves.